Stream.
Yep, okay. Good evening, everyone, and usual beginning with the prayer. Heavenly King, comfort the Spirit of truth, who everywhere present, fills all things, treasury of blessings, and giver of life, come and abide in us and cleanse us from every impurity, save our souls a good one. All right, so I'm not sure how many people we have online because I'm being told that the email didn't go out. I hope I'm not saying the wrong thing. Anyway, it is what it is. And as I mentioned last time, we will have meetings every week until the Sunday of St. Mary of Egypt. So that's 4 weeks in a row, rather than every fortnight. And another feature of these Lenten meetings will be that I'm going to introduce some Lenten material because there are very important topics raised during Great Lent. So they need to be mentioned in addition to what we're doing as our main bit of work, is commenting, looking at the four Gospels. So tonight, I'll begin by talking about, three things associated with Lent and with this Sunday today. So that's about Great Lent, a Sunday of Orthodoxy, and also the icon as theology. Now, obviously, I can't go into much detail. It'll be fairly superficial. I'm trying to cover pretty big topics, 3 of them, but at least it will give some indication what we're talking about. So first of all, Great Lent, a little bit of history. We hear from Eusebius, in the first church historian, Eusebius of Caesarea, wrote church history. Lived in the 4th century, is a participant in the first ecumenical council of Nicaea, and he wrote that history. He was a sort of a personal friend of Emperor Constantine, and also known for a magnificent library, probably the best private library in the world of those times, at least in the Greco-Roman world. So he, in his history, quotes an earlier writer, Saint Irenaeus of Lyon, a bishop in Gaul, yes, modern France, a magnificent theologian and one of the great early fathers. Lived born about 130 AD and died at the turn of the 3rd century, so it was in the beginning of the 3rd century. And Irenaeus says that in his time, so we're talking about the 2nd century, the preparation before Easter lasted several days. So he gives a few days. And from various other authors later on, we know that it was from 1 to 6 days preparation in the earliest church. Now, the first mention of Great Lent as a period of 40 days actually comes up in one of the canons, Canon 5 of the first Great Council, the Nicene Council. And Canon 5 refers to meetings of bishops that were to occur either before Lent or in autumn. Now, Lent is referred to as Tessarakosti. Tessarakosti means period of 40 days in Greek. So the way that it's mentioned in the canon makes one think that in the early 4th century, it was already an established practice because it is mentioned without any further explanations. Now, there are mentions of the 40-day fast, a number of mentions by Saint Athanasius the Great, the father of Orthodoxy, champion Orthodoxy in the First Council, who accompanied his bishop, Alexander of the city of Alexandria. And he himself was the archdeacon then, but later became the ruling bishop of the great Alexandrian and Egyptian church. And a great theologian. He mentions Lent, 40-day Lent, in his writings, including one Paschal epistle. And they're mentioned by some other Eastern writers, such as Saint Cyril of Jerusalem, who, by the way, connects with something that I'm going to say in a minute. Saint Cyril of Jerusalem did a lot to establish a kind of a syllabus. He has published homilies for catechumens that show his exceptional knowledge of the scriptures. All of those homilies were said ad lib, were, without preparation. But like literally in every sentence, there's at least one reference, either direct or oblique reference to a scriptural verse or section of the scriptures. So he mentions that, and also a 4th century saint who lived to a very old age. I think he died at the age of 105. Epiphanius of Cyprus also mentions 40-day Lent. Homily. Homily is a sermon, or a speech typically about a feast or some explanation of the scriptures. In the West, we have a slightly later mentions of the 40-day fast, and the first mention of that comes up in the writings of the great Latin father, Saint Ambrose of Milan. In the late 4th century, he mentions 40-day Lent. Right. So what are the origins of this idea of having a 40-day fasting period? Well, first of all, of course, we have the Old Testament prophets, Moses and Elijah, who fasted for 40 days. And the Lord himself, Lord Jesus Christ, fasted for 40 days after his baptism in preparation for the beginning of his ministry, to fortify himself as a human being. So it's clear that in the early centuries, this connection between the baptism of Christ and the fast was introduced in the catechetical system to prepare catechumens Thank you so much, Chris. Prepare catechumens for baptism in this manner. And that probably arose in the second half of the 3rd century, because, for instance, Alexandria at that time already had a very prominent catechetical school, produced big names like Origen, for instance. Okay. So, keep track of time. Now, the early customs of actual fasting, as well as the period of this Lent, varied greatly throughout the Christian world of the early centuries. The 5th century church historian Sozomen mentions that a number of different practices. He goes through the ways that people actually fasted in different places, and it's very interesting that one of the types or practices of fasting was exactly like the Ramadan practice of Muslims. And so this is where the Muslims, of course, got it from. I was always sure that the Muslims got the idea of Ramadan from, as you know, you have to look at the Quran. You only have to look at the Quran to see how much scriptural stuff there is there, you know, from the New Testament and the Old Testament. But also the practice of Ramadan is exactly the same as some of the practices in the Middle East. So the way that Christians in the Middle East would fast in the early centuries was they wouldn't eat anything until until the evening, but then they would eat everything. Okay. So that was just one of the practices. Now, regarding the times and the weeks, Jerusalem practiced 8 weeks of 5 days, 5-day Lent, because Saturday and Sunday were considered non-Lenten days. I mean, still to this day, our liturgical practices reflect the fact that both Saturday and Sunday are festal days. And so there is no fasting in the strict sense. There is, in the periods of fasting, such as Great Lent, there is still some restriction on food intake during the weekend, Saturday and Sunday, but not as strict as during Monday to Friday. So yes. So this is the way Jerusalem did it, already in the 4th century. Other Christian churches, Eastern churches, had 7 weeks of 5 days. The West had a slightly different attitude. They had 6 weeks of 6 days of fasting, because Saturday was included as a fast day in the West. The East, which is closer to the lands of the Bible, retained the connection to the Sabbath much more, and the early tradition of the church, which retained the Sabbath as a special day. Yes, around about the 7th century, not around about, but it was in the 7th century, the West added this practice of adding another 4 days to the 36 days, and began Lent 4 days earlier on Ash Wednesday. And the Eastern Church, of course, Lent begins on the Monday. So that's interesting. Now,
Catholics have Ash Wednesday and Good Friday.
yes, well,
Just those two.
that's right. In 1966, at Vatican II, the Roman Church decided that there would be two strictly sort of strict fast days, the first day of Lent and the Good Friday. Okay, so Ash Wednesday and Good Friday. Okay, and anything else was will be optional. Yes, it's also, you know, when you read about historical practices and liturgics and that, there's a great variety of practices there, and it's interesting that in the Western Church, from the time of the schism in the 11th century, of course, things began to the fasting practices began to kind of mellow quite a bit, and by first of all allowing food earlier in the day, more and more, and then introducing even milk products eventually, until the 14th century. Roman Catholics fasted on Wednesdays, 14th century, as well as Fridays, of course. That practice, I mean, some Catholics still keep to Friday fish. So, yeah. All right, but we're getting off the track a bit. So, in the early centuries, generally, during Lent, one meal a day was allowed after Vespers. And Vespers, of course, was served after the 9th hour. And the 9th hour is 3 p.m. So, you know, you're talking about meals, you know, between 4 and 6 p.m. Okay. Now, an interesting aspect of Lenten practice to this day in the Orthodox Church is the liturgy of pre-sanctified gifts, which is basically a Vespers with communion, to put it very succinctly. But it's attributed to one of the great popes of Rome, the 6th century Pope Gregory, who's called the Great in the West, and he's called the Dialogist in the East because of his, he was very prolific in writing. One of his writings is called the Dialogue Concerning the Faith. So yes, that's his 6th century. This liturgy of pre-sanctified gifts in its earliest form is attributed to him. And that's why we commemorate him at the end of this liturgy. Now, it's a beautiful service. It has a very specific Lenten character, because from the earliest times, Christians thought that it was improper to serve the Eucharist in the weekdays of Lent, because Lent, Monday to Friday, is a time of restraint and sorrow and mourning for our sins, repentance. And so Christians left the Eucharist for Saturdays and Sundays, which were not part of Lent. So but they still wanted to receive Holy Communion. So how do you do that? Well, the early church widely practiced keeping of this holy sacraments even at home, especially during persecutions. Everybody had access to communion. And so people would receive Holy Communion one way or another during weekdays of Lent, from pre-sanctified holy gifts. And this is how they're incorporated into the well, practice has been around for hundreds of years, but still continues to this day in the Eastern Church, Orthodox Church. So typically on each Sunday of Great Lent, and it starts with the Forgiveness Sunday, because we do the first two liturgies of pre-sanctified gifts in the first week of Lent. Instead of one lamb, 3 lambs are consecrated, and the 2 of them are used typically on Wednesdays and Fridays of Lent. Right. Okay, so that's enough about liturgy of pre-sanctified gifts. Now, Sunday of Orthodoxy. This is the event we remember today, celebrate today. It was the year 842 AD, and the young boy emperor Michael, with his regent mother Theodora, empress, re-established the veneration of icons formally, aided by the patriarch of Constantinople, Methodius, who actually wrote a special rite for the occasion. And it was decided that this rite and this celebration would be practiced every year, lest we should fall into iconoclasm again, to kind of keep a memory of this event. So this is what we did today. So it's called Triumph of Orthodoxy rather than Triumph of Icon Veneration, for the reason that it was seen even in those times as a sort of a completion of the period of great councils, which began in 325 AD and finished in 787 AD with the Seventh Council. So 325 was Nicaea, which we already mentioned today. And it's not that there weren't any more important councils. And I mean, the Roman Catholics have many more councils that they call great councils or ecumenical councils, but the Orthodox chose to keep to this number of 7. 7 is a nice number, all right? That's a nice symbolic number. And it doesn't mean that there can't be any more heresies, and there were since then, of course, there have been. But as many of the early medieval theologians said, the work of these councils in the theology of the Holy Trinity, the so-called triadology, and also the theology of Jesus Christ, Christology, they cover the most important aspects of the faith and teaching of the church. And for events in the future, the church can always look back to the results and achievements of those councils to find its orientation with regard to new challenges. Okay, and a practice actually arose during the period of the first councils. It was to read. It was at the beginning of the Christological period. They began to every council with a reading of the Nicene Creed, because that became a benchmark, a starting point for all discussions. It's a statement of the faith of the church, what we believe. But of course, the Nicene Creed, even though it talks predominantly about Jesus Christ, there are still many things that were clarified later, after the 4th century, after the Nicene, the first two councils when it was written. As it said, its proper name is Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed. Yeah, the first creed of 325 was expanded in 381. Right. Now, the topic of iconos theology. Leonid Uspensky, the author of very solid book, Theology of the Icon, he writes that iconoclasm was not just a historical phenomenon in the Eastern Church of the 8th and 9th century. Actually, the controversy lasted a long time, from 726 AD to 787. That was the first phase, long, several decades. Then there was a little break after the Seventh Council, and then there was a second period, which was not as intense, but the second period lasted until 842 AD. So he says, he writes in the book that there is, in different forms, a permanency to iconoclasm. And he lists 3 examples of this. The medieval French heretics, Christian dissidents, the Albigensians, okay, they were iconoclasts. The 15th century Russian heretics, Judaizers, who borrowed a lot from the Old Testament. And there are actually a number of Western Protestant denominations, or, you know, we can say they're kind of like sectarians, really. They are heavily influenced by the Old Testament, and, you know, the Jewish culture of the Old Testament, and to the detriment of New Testament. And finally, of course, we have the 16th century Protestant reformers, who to this day are iconoclastic in their outlook. They do not accept icons. Now, not all of them. I mean, for instance, the Anglicans do like, even they can be classified as Protestants. The Anglican Church has a spectrum of practices and beliefs within it. It depends what you're talking about, you know, high church or low church. They begin from you know, Anglo-Catholics down to you know, very Protestant outlook. But at least in the Anglo-Catholic side of the spectrum, icons are much loved. You know, you will find typically some icons in Anglican churches nowadays. All right, so what was the problem? What were the objections of the iconoclasts? Well, just like some of the Protestants today, they said, they began with very basic accusations that you cannot treat objects of wood or stone or whatever in that way, that this is making an idol out of them, okay, idols. And they also referred to the Old Testament prohibition of making images. But anyone who talks about Old Testament prohibition of graven images has to be aware as well that when God gave Moses instructions about the setting up of the tabernacle, he gave also instructions about images on the lid of the Ark of the Covenant, and also of cherubs, cherubim, and large image of the cherubim before the veil, the screen of the Holy of Holies as well. So it wasn't a total prohibition. Okay, right. So that I think people need to be a little bit nuanced, begin talking in a kind of a blanket way about prohibition of the Old Testament. Now, some of the iconoclasts of the 8th and 9th centuries were more flexible and tolerant to the idea of having some images which they thought would be okay as long as they were higher up and couldn't be reached for veneration. They would play a didactic role. Okay, they would tell stories to the unlettered people about the Bible, this and that. Okay. Now, so what was the Orthodox response to this? So from the beginning, from the year 726 AD, the Orthodox basically had a very clear dogmatic stance. They emphasized Christology, that the icon was a statement that expressed our belief in the incarnation of the Word becoming flesh. If we are serious about believing that the invisible became visible, that the infinite became finite in flesh, that the Son of God became the Son of Man, and we're not like the early heretics called Docetists or Docetists from dokeo, the Greek word meaning to see, seeming, something seems. Okay, so the Docetists taught that Christ's flesh was just a kind of a mirage. He took on this flesh to communicate to humanity all these things, but really God couldn't become incarnate. But the Orthodox said it is precisely because the Church strictly believed from the apostolic age that Christ is the fully God and fully man, Word incarnate, invisible made visible. This is why we not only may, but we should use images of him. And because these images of him emphasize our seriousness, the seriousness of our belief in the incarnation, the reality of the incarnation. So, for the Orthodox tradition, icons, yes, they of course have a didactic purpose as well. They do tell stories, but they're much more than just a picture telling a story, because it is, iconography is as the prominent Russian art critic, Prince Eugene Trubetskoy said, that iconography is theology in color. That's a great expression, really concise summing up of what iconography is. Now, in the mid-8th century, one of the iconoclastic emperors, and it's interesting that iconoclasts and this drive to get rid of icons in the churches and in the church, even in the home, came from above, from the emperors. And interestingly also, it seems that those emperors, just like some of the Roman emperors that were the best sovereigns, the best administrators, were also the worst persecutors of Christianity. Same in the Byzantine times with these iconoclastic, and they're very secular in their outlook. And of course, they wanted to use the church for their own purposes, and their purposes were political. They, a kind of a hidden agenda of iconoclasm was to hopefully get rid of one problem that the Muslims had with Christians about the usage of icons, because you see, Islam appeared in this time, in the 7th century, just in a century earlier, and expanded very quickly. And so the Byzantine emperors were very worried about the shrinking of the empire. And they thought, well, maybe this is one way we could have the Muslims on side if we don't venerate images. Right. So in the mid-8th century, one of these emperors, Constantine V, presented a theological treatise to an iconoclastic council that assembled in Constantinople in the year 754 AD. In his paper, he put forward very extreme views. He rejected the veneration of the Mother of God and the saints. All of that was excluded together with iconography. And he advanced an interesting theological point, which of course was quickly debunked by the Orthodox. Well, it was an interesting attempt. He said that a true icon must be of the same nature as the person that it represents. So it must be consubstantial with the person. And he said, for that reason, the only true image of Christ is the Eucharist, the bread and wine, because they are consubstantial with Christ himself. But the Orthodox said the holy gifts are not an icon, not an image of Christ, precisely because they are Christ himself. Okay? Christ takes the bread and wine, our gifts, and accepts them into his person, into his hypostasis. They become part of him. This is the Orthodox teaching. Right? So they are no longer an image of him. They are an image of him if we think in Nestorian ways, and in the ways that, like, a lot of the Protestant churches think about, or denominations think about the Eucharist, that it is a symbol of, it has a symbolic meaning, okay? The body and blood in a symbolic way, not in any real sense. Okay. Now, some aspects of traditional Orthodox iconography. Well, first of all, there are quite a few rules or canons of iconography. And we begin with the following, that an icon of Christ must have a cruciform halo. And inside that halo, cruciform halo, there must be the word which stands for the tetragram, the sacred name of God given to Moses at the burning bush. In Greek, on, which means I am. Okay, Yahweh. Well, I'll get out the way. I wonder if, do you have a way of coming closer to that icon there? No, there's no way we can do it, is there? Just to show without, to zoom in. Can you zoom in? Okay. All right. Our operator Chris is trying to zoom in now. Okay, just programming that, and hopefully you'll just see this icon of Christ there with the halo that I'm talking about. Yes, no? Zooming in. Mm-hmm. Something's happening. We've gone up. I'd like to look at the icon on the iconostasis. The one of Christ there. There it is. It's hard to. Which one? Yeah, that one there. Yes. Come up closer so we, yeah. Well, you can see the halo now, just so we can see the top part. All right, so you see the article O and then on, or on, and the cruciform shape of the halo. Okay, good. Thank you, Chris. That's fine. Okay, we can go back. Woo. Okay, just a couple of other points. The icon uses stylistic technique as a developed form of theological language. It's talking about glorified flesh. It's not, the icon does not represent the heavy flesh of fallen man, but the transfigured, divinized flesh. All right. Now, this is especially true since the theological achievements of the Palamist epoch of the 14th century, when St. Gregory, whom we will celebrate next Sunday, introduced a theological vocabulary to talk about the energies of God. All right, so iconography and the language of iconography absorbed these theological ideas, and now you can. Now I would need more time to talk about this. I still would like to cover our gospel bit as well. So quickly, now just mentioning that from the 14th century onwards, we got the period of what's called the Paleolog Renaissance. These ideas, these theological and artistic iconographic ideas spread throughout the Orthodox world, especially into the Balkans, the Slavic Balkans, and the Eastern Slavs. Right. Just a quick mention about iconography of the icons of the Mother of God. Chris, I might ask you to travel to the iconostasis again. Okay. Can you go up to the icon of the Mother of God? Okay. Yeah, the big one on the left of the iconostasis, or the royal doors. Okay, so okay. So what I want you to see is 3 stars. So there's 1 star on one shoulder of the Mother of God. There's 1 star on the top of the head covering. At the moment, we're getting a bit of a reflection there. Now I can see it. Chris, can you shift? Oh, yes, that's it. That's it. So we can see the star on the head of the Mother of God. Okay. And there's 1 on the other shoulder. Just move away from that oil lamp so that we can see the star near Christ, near the baby Jesus. Okay, come in. See, there's another star there. Okay. Now these are 8-pointed stars. There's 3 of them. The 3 stars talk about the dogma of ever virginity. See, there's 8 points to them. She is a virgin. This is connected to the whole teaching of Christology. She's a virgin before, during, and after incarnation. Okay, there the stars. Now, the 8 points developed actually out of 2 superimposed squares. Now, in the ancient Greek physics, the square was a symbol of the 3 states of matter and energy, or to put it in those words, was earth, water, air, and fire, right? And the Christians use 2 squares, 1 superimposed on the other, to create an 8-pointed star, to communicate the theological idea that in the incarnation, the laws of nature were shifted. They were tweaked. So, the physical world, yes, in the incarnation of the Word was altered. Okay, so I'm just really touching the tip of the iceberg here in terms of the language of iconography, but just so that when you next see baby Jesus also has a cruciform halo, and the word that the sacred name. All right, now enough about that. We just will use the last 10 minutes or so to read the gospel story, which tonight is about the heading of St. John the Baptist. And so, Mark chapter 6 from verse 14 to verse 29. Okay. Now King Herod heard of him, for his name had become well known. And he said, John the Baptist is risen from the dead, and therefore these powers are work in him. Others said, it is Elijah. And others said, it is the prophet, or like one of the prophets. But when Herod heard, he said, this is John, whom I beheaded. He has been raised from the dead. For Herod himself had sent and laid hold of John and bound him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, for he had married her. Because John had said to Herod, it is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. Therefore Herodias held it against him and wanted to kill him. But she could not, for Herod feared John, knowing that he was a just and holy man, and he protected him. And when he heard him, he did many things and heard him gladly. Then an opportune day came when Herod, on his birthday, gave a feast for his nobles, the high officers, and the chief men of Galilee. And when Herodias' daughter herself came in and danced, she pleased Herod and those who sat with him. The king said to the girl, ask me whatever you want, and I will give it to you. He also swore to her, whatever you ask me, I will give you, up to half of my kingdom. So she went out and said to her mother, what shall I ask? And she said, head of John the Baptist. Immediately she came in with haste to the king and asked, saying, I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter. And the king was exceedingly sorry. Yet because of the oaths, and because of those who sat with him, he did not want to refuse her. Immediately the king sent an executioner and commanded his head to be brought. And he went and beheaded him in prison, brought his head on a platter and gave it to the girl, and the girl gave it to her mother. When his disciples heard of it, they came and took away his corpse and laid it in a tomb. Right. Quite an awful story there. Now, again, this story about rumors about Christ at the court of Herod is covered by all of the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, whom we read, and Luke. So Luke is very brief, and in comparison with Matthew and Mark, mentions only in passing about the Baptist's death. We have in Luke Herod saying, I beheaded John. Who is this Jesus? Luke mentions that Herod wished to see Jesus. It seems that while there were many opinions about Jesus among the people, Herod tended to believe that he was John risen from the dead. It's probably because his conscience bothered him. It's clear from the story that he really didn't want to execute John, but he was trapped. He didn't want to lose face after he made these promises with an oath, and in front of a drunken audience. So now about the forerunners' imprisonment. Matthew speaks of Herod's intention of killing John, but Mark shows that it was his wife who engineered the murder. Herod knew that the people revered John, and he was afraid of the people. He also himself, as Mark writes, feared John as a charismatic prophet. And he enjoyed conversations with him and even listened to some of his advice, except the main thing that John was saying to him, that it was unlawful for him to have his brother's wife. So just a little bit of historical background, which of course we can't work out from the Gospels, but we have other sources, especially Josephus, the younger contemporary of the apostolic period, who was alive at the time of the Jewish War, and he wrote two books, Jewish Antiquities and the Jewish War, and he wanted to ingratiate himself to the Roman Emperor. He presented his books to him. So he writes that Herodias was the daughter of Aristobulus, the son of Herod the Great, from his second marriage. And Herod the Great was quite a terrible bloke. One of the, I think it was Tiberius, who was a contemporary of Herod, or even, sorry, not Tiberius, it was even Augustus, said that with Herod, you're better off being a pig than one of his sons, because he had several marriages and a number of sons, and he killed some of them. So anyway, Herodias was the daughter of Aristobulus, the son of Herod the Great from his second marriage. Her grandfather, that's Herod the Great, wished that she would marry Philip, a son from his third marriage. Philip lived as a private citizen in Jerusalem. He was not a ruler. And so Herodias was married to Philip. And she had the daughter, Salome, who danced in front of Antipas. Herod, by the way, is the family name, surname. And the Roman practice was to have this surname, like in Chinese, surname first and then the given name second, third, whatever. So she left Philip to become the wife of Herod Antipas, who was also a son of Herod the Great, from his fourth marriage. Right? Now, Antipas was a ruler. He was a tetrarch. So he ruled a quarter of Palestine. And so his tetrarchy was Galilee and Perea. So Galilee and across the Jordan, stretching down to the Dead Sea. And so he abandoned his lawful wife, who was the daughter of the Arabian king Aretas, or Aretas. Now, Antipas imprisoned John in his fortress, Machaerna, near the Dead Sea, which was close to his Heraian residence in the town of Julia. When he was living in Galilee, he would be living in the city of Tiberias. So, but he preferred to live in Perea. So, the reason why he starts thinking that Jesus is John risen from the dead is because after the murder of John the Baptist, he moved from the south to Galilee, and there he became aware of these widespread rumors about Jesus Christ as the great prophet, this and that, and all sorts of opinions about Jesus. And so I thought, he must be John, whom I executed. So that's it for tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, no questions, that's great. I can have a rest. It's been a serious week. Glory be to God. We're now into the second week of Great Lent, and with somewhat lesser intensity now, but still keeping alight that torch of Lent. All right, so we'll say the prayer and depart in peace. It is truly meet to bless thee, O Theotokos, ever blessed and most pure, and the mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, beyond compare, more glorious than the seraphim. Without corruption, they gave us birth to God, the Word. The true Theotokos, be to remain with them. Good evening, and God willing, I'll see you next week. Next Sunday. We're having them every Sunday of Lent. Are you okay with that, Chris? Yeah, right? Good.